we have alluded throughout this podcast several times to EPM and impact metrics. So I did want to kind of cover that topic in a little more holistic way for our audience out there, so that everybody can be on the same page about kind of what we're talking about. So this past Sunday, and a hat tip to Andrew Claudio, GMAC, who brought this to my attention. Dunks and Threes dropped their first batch or first release of EPM grades for the season using the small sample of games that we've seen so far. So I do want to just kind of talk about in general what EPM is and kind of what one number impact metrics are and what they mean and how I and Geoff and others use them. So in general, impact metrics are basically like a single number metric that gives you like a general estimate of how much value a player provides to their team. So it's much different from anything like points and assists and shooting percentages and all that stuff, because it's essentially a summary of everything a player does and contributes on the court to either positively or negatively impact their team. And a lot of this stuff will not be captured by any kind of box score counting stat. Even player tracking data will not be able to capture a lot of the things that players do to impact the game in a positive or negative way. So that's what these kind of impact metrics attempt to do. And they're typically represented as the impact that a player has on his team, on his team's number of points or a point differential every 100 possessions. So if we say like, oh, this guy's a +5 EPM guy, that means that it's estimated that every 100 possessions that player is estimated to be responsible for like a 5-point positive differential in the score. If I say he's a -5 EPM player, it's the opposite, which would also mean he's probably out of the league. If I said he's a -5 EPM player, there aren't many guys like that. So yeah, there's a few key kind of aspects about impact metrics that make them a lot different from, raw on-off numbers. So one is that impact metrics take into consideration the strength of a player's teammates that he's sharing the court with, and also the strength of the opponents that he's playing against. So for example, if a player like exclusively comes off the bench, we talked about quickly in this regard, this is not the case for him because he started a ton. But if a player comes exclusively off the bench and essentially only crushes opposing bench players, then impact metrics take this into account, so you can still directly compare them with starters. So it's not really a strong argument to say, oh, that guy's a +3 EPM, but he comes off the bench, so that's why it's like shaded that way. Like that's not that you can compare them directly. And then the final point I wanted to make about this is really important. Impact metrics essentially are kind of assumed to imply causality, and I may get pushback from people on this, but I think this is a really important point, because when we look at like on-off numbers, they do not imply causality whatsoever. I looked up this example, just the first person that came off the top of my head. Last year, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, who is a really good player, had an on-off differential of +17.3. So this doesn't mean that the Nuggets were 17 points better per 100 possessions when he was on the court because of him, right? So for example, a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that 81% of the time he was on the court, he was playing with Nikola Jokic. Only 19% of the time that KCP was ever on the court last year, Jokic was on the bench. So it's probably not like because of KCP that the Nuggets were so much better when he was on the court. And honestly, in some cases, and this is not the case with KCP because he is an excellent player, in some cases, your team can perform well despite you being on the court, right? You could be a hindrance to the team, but the rest of the team around you or a superstar player is so good that they still find a way to have a positive impact when you're on the court. So this is just like, figuring out who is actually responsible for success or failure of the team is like the key thing in analyzing basketball, in my opinion. It's like, it all comes down to responsibility. And it's just something that box score numbers or counting stats or even shooting percentages or even like true shooting percentage, all of that, it cannot help you know who is responsible for success or failure of a team. It's the thing that I think that most people miss when analyzing basketball. And, you can see like certain counting stats, and that might make us make assumptions about how valuable that player is. But in a vacuum, like most counting stats don't really tell you anything about a player's value. You need contextual information. You need to understand a lot more. I wanted to give one quick example just to talk about causality. So, determining causality is super, super tricky in literally everything, in any science. And that's like the goal of most science, is determine causality. So here's an example. Like if you have a cold and you take some vitamin C and then you feel better the next day, you might conclude like, I feel better because I took vitamin C, right? So you might think that vitamin C is super valuable and cures colds. However, you don't know the counterfactual situation, which would be like what would happen if you didn't take vitamin C. So imagine if we could like reverse time and then you don't take the vitamin C, but then you still feel better the next day. Then we would now kind of understand like vitamin C probably had nothing to do with why you felt better. So there was no causal relationship there. And this is, I think, a mistake that happens all the time. We see like a player score 30 points and then the team wins, and it's like, well, the team won because that player scored 30 points. That doesn't mean that. We don't know. We need more information to be able to like assess causality there. It could be that that player like really almost shot his team out of the game, and the way that they were playing almost cost them the game, but they won in spite of that player. Like we just don't know. So that's kind of the high level description I wanted to give of like impact metrics and what they try to do, and kind of the goals and like how I use them and in terms of like basketball analysis.
My favorite example of misunderstood or misunderstood causality is Mike McCarthy, the head coach of now the Dallas Cowboys, but the human being who was at one point in his life paid millions of dollars to come up with a game plan for Aaron Rodgers, one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. One week he said that he saw a stat that said that teams that run the ball 20 or more times in the second half win 90% of the time. So his goal is to run the ball 20 or more times in the second half every game, because that'll mean they win 90% of the time.
So McCarthy's sitting there down 28 points. He's like, you know what we need to do to win this game? We need to run the ball.
We just need 20 plus runs, guys. That's all we need. I just remember watching that and being like, holy shit. Like, oh my God. Like, and then
that's awesome. Like,
that just goes into a whole, that you go down that rabbit hole. It's like, this is $1 billion franchise. This is the whole franchise is being good. That's it. That's the whole that's where all the revenue comes from. Playoff games. They were like, let's give millions of dollars to this guy who doesn't know what the fuck. Like, I'm sure he's good at, I don't know. So that's another interesting thing is people always talk about, oh, well, there's stuff you don't know that these guys know. And this is perfect example of your counterfactual. Nobody knows what it would look like if 30 people who thought like we did were all head coaches. So you can't argue that, oh, they have this intangible thing that you'll never have. And like, I don't think I'd be a good coach. I joke about it all the time. Can you imagine Julius Randle and me walking up to Julius Randle like, hey, can you give more effort? He'd laugh in my face. Like, no, I wouldn't be a good coach. I wouldn't be able to earn the respect. I get that. That's fine. But my point is that there's no proof that people who are more analytically minded thinkers wouldn't be good coach, and that you need this macho. The only reason that the proof that those guys succeed is because it keeps being reinforced over and over again, because they're the only guys that get hired.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that shines a light on both flawed causality and the need for, a counterfactual. The only way to determine that, a certain type of coach is optimal is to actually have a large sample size of all the different types of personalities and see how they coach and see how they mesh with players.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that is the whole issue. And so, in science, we do randomized control trials to try to essentially emulate a scenario in which you do have this counterfactual, because we can't, like, really the way we would figure out if coaches, a type of coach was more successful than another is that we would run, dozens or hundreds of seasons with one type of coach, and then we'd like go backwards and run those same seasons with the other type of coach and then compare the results. Obviously we can't do that. So like, that's what randomized control trials are meant to simulate, a scenario in which we were doing that by kind of matching, characteristics and criteria across two groups such that they look similar enough that we can assume that the outcomes, if the outcomes are different, it's related to the independent variable that we're trying to measure. This has just gotten like I just caught myself in the middle of like talking about independent variables, and I'm like, this has gone a little too far.
To sort of reel it in, this is why expressing a certainty about anything is so misguided. And, if you're out there with an open mind, just keep that, and don't just, the smartest people are the least sure. I can guarantee you that. The people who are super confident in pretty much anything, just anything, from the sports, politics, just any people out there who are just sure they have the world figured out and they have all the answers, they're probably not as smart as they think they are. And the people who are open-minded and are seeking out alternative viewpoints and just trying to gather as much data as possible, they're the people you should cling to and you should listen to and interact with, not just listen to and share your opinions with.
Right. Yeah. And I totally agree with that. And if you'll notice, like, when I have disagreements with people, oftentimes it tends to be that, like, it's hard to pin me down because oftentimes my point is just like, we're not sure that that's the case, right? Like that's normally where I'm coming from. It's like, how do you know that that's the case? Like you need to have strong evidence to support any claim that you have. And I'm just generally always going to push for the evidence to show me if someone has a really strong claim, oh, this is how it is, this is what it is. I would just want to see what that evidence looks like, and then measure the veracity of that evidence to determine whether I think that that's like an accurate claim that's supported by the evidence or not. As far as EPM, so EPM, estimated plus minus, when kind of these impact metrics were tested for predictive value, meaning, the ones that have the least amount of prediction error, EPM tends to win those tests in terms of like being the least errorful of them. So EPM is, currently, I would say, the best one number impact metric that is publicly available. I'm sure NBA teams have better data, but in terms of publicly available, EPM is probably the best. So EPM dropped their ratings or grades, if you would have it. Is there anything that stuck out to you when you kind of took a look at this that you wanted to talk about? Surprises, like things that don't seem right, maybe due to like noise, due to small samples, anything that really stuck out to you?
Yeah, I think you have to start with Scottie Barnes, honestly. And I know you have a personal stake in this. That's not going to end well for you if this keeps up, but yikes. I gotta be honest, I'm a little gun shy with putting out takes like that on the internet because I just know how the world works, and I don't know what I have out there in the world, but oh man, I'd be nervous if I was you. That's a strong take that you made.
I'm assuming you're referring to my take that I'd rather have Quentin Grimes than Scottie Barnes. Is that correct? Is that okay? So
I didn't want to fully throw you under the bus. I was kind of pushing you a little bit towards the bus, but I wasn't rolling you under it.
That's totally fine. Like I don't have like, it's not going to hurt my feelings or make me feel dumb or insecure if that take turns out to be wrong. Like that's fine. Everybody has wrong takes. Like that's not. I'm not ashamed or crawling into a hole as a result. I don't think that the performance that we've seen from Scottie Barnes was like obvious or like you could see him that he was gonna ascend to have this performance in this early part of the season. Like I don't feel like it was crazy. Scottie Barnes is just shooting like 40% from three this year. He shot 30% on low volume his rookie season. He shot 28% on low volume his second year in the league. He's shooting 40% on relatively high volume this year. Like you can't project if a guy's just gonna like learn how to shoot. To me, that's like the hardest thing to do. So,
you can't. But I'm sorry to just sort of hop in
go
here,
ahead.
but let's give him a little bit more credit than that. He's rebounding more. He's assisting more.
No. I'm not saying that's the only reason why he's been good. I'm just saying that's an example of like a reason why he's been really good. I also want to say, as far as like his EPM, like you're right. He's had impact in a lot of other ways. Like his assist percentage has gone through the roof, and he's in more of a playmaking role. His usage has increased. A lot of things he's doing better. Also, in terms of EPM, he has a defensive EPM of plus 3.2. That is number one in the entire NBA. Like a defense of plus 3.2. Like I don't think Scottie Barnes is a plus 3.2 defensive player in the league. Like that would make him an all-time great perimeter defender if he was to like maintain that moving forward. I don't think that that's the case. I mean, we're talking about a 13-game small sample. I think Scottie Barnes has played well enough that I can say he's going to be really good. Do I think he's going to be in the MVP conversation? No, not at all. According to EPM, he's sixth right now in EPM, behind LeBron James, Steph Curry, is SGA, Nikola Jokic, and Embiid. Like, is that the tier of player that he's in? You can tell me. Is that what you believe? Since I want you to be under the bus with me. If that's you can now just say that that's your opinion if it is.
No, I don't think he's this good. But I do think the fact that he's capable of a stretch like this is impressive in its own right. That needs to be given, and defensively, I do think this goes back to the thing we talked about earlier in the podcast. I don't think it's totally reasonable to say, oh, well, he's never defended this well before, so he must not be this level of defender, and it must be mostly noise. Well, he was known for defense coming out of college. The reason he was drafted so high was because of his potential defensive ceiling and his versatility, his ability to stay out with wings on the perimeter and also go big and to bang on the inside. Defensive EPM is telling us he's finally fulfilling that. He's a 22-year-old who is in his third year. I don't think it's outrageous to say that, oh, maybe he just is making a leap, and maybe he's actually closer to this defensive impact than you're giving credit to.
I think I notice a little bit of a trend. I think you're kind of misconstruing what I'm saying with some of this stuff. Like, I don't mean he hasn't played at a high defensive level in his first 2 years and his age 20 and 21 seasons. Therefore, that's the player that he is, and he's not going to get better at that thing. Like, I never mean that. What I'm saying is that I tend to not believe that a player is like the greatest of all time or in a category of the greatest of all time at a particular thing unless I've seen it across a really large sample. That really is my position, because oftentimes we're talking about a thing where it's like, even take RJ Barrett, like he's shooting whatever it is, 47% from three. I don't know if it probably went up after the most recent game, because I think it was 3 or 4. He's shooting close to 50% from three. I'm not saying, hey, because RJ hasn't shot really well throughout his career, that means he can't be a better improved 3-point shooter at 23 years old. I'm saying RJ Barrett is not a 50% 3-point shooter. I'm saying Scottie Barnes is very likely not the best perimeter defensive player of all time. Like that's what and those claims I don't feel like need a lot to substantiate. I think that the prior and the kind of assumption is always going to be like that height is just so astronomically unlikely that that's what we can assume until proven otherwise. And that's kind of what I'm saying. I'm never saying like this guy is 22 years old, he couldn't be better than he has been. Of course, guys make leaps. There are going to be a number of players every year that are going to make a leap. Like that is almost like guaranteed for sure. And Scottie Barnes could be one of those guys. He could be a great defensive player. I don't think he's going to be one of the greatest perimeter defensive players of all time. That's where I feel like that's a very low bar that I have to cross to kind of say that.
Yeah, for sure. But even if you reduce his defensive impact by 33%, he's still a really good defender who improved from last season.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's a more reasonable defensive impact based on, not being one of the best defenders ever. And
Right.
my point is that given his pedigree and given his profile, and the fact that he's capable of putting together a 13 game stretch where EPM has him in that level of defensive impact, I don't think it's a leap to say, okay, well, clearly he's gotten a lot better. And even when his impact regresses a little bit, he's still he's left himself room to still be a very, very impactful player.
Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that he is likely a very good to excellent defensive player in the NBA. And I agree with you. Like, even a 13 game sample is not nothing, and to be able to put together the level of impact that he has across 13 games is extremely meaningful. Like, I totally agree with that. So I don't disagree too much with what you said. Besides that, kind of like where I'm coming from is like, I don't think that this player I would assume that they would cross this like amazing threshold unless I see it across more than even one season. Because I will say, like, for instance, OG Anunoby had a similar EPM grade across 67 games last year, and has not performed to that standard so far this year. And, very likely he never will make it to that standard again. So, yeah, I just am always going to kind of bank on like some level of regression when you see some of these high heights. And I think honestly, this is an interesting conversation, because I think what's interesting is also, and you might have mentioned this about something else in the past, but what's interesting is like the order in which things happen. So if Scottie Barnes was like kind of like bad defensively for 13 games, I think people would be dogpiling on him. And then if he was like this level for another 13 game stretch, I don't think people would be like, wow, this is like a transcendent, MVP caliber player, because they would have the context of the kind of, they would be primed to believe that like he's struggling, or like a struggling player or something like that. I think it makes a big difference when you start the season in a certain way, and people have a difficult time kind of adjusting from that starting point that they viewed you at like early on in the season. I think we see that kind of on a regular basis.
But also, those two examples aren't perfectly apples to apples, because there's a huge difference between the first 13 games and the second 13 games. And the difference is that the first 13 games are coming off a 5-month off season where you practice and you train and you improve. So it's much harder to go from what Scottie Barnes did last year. Like, let's just say, I'm not looking at his EPM, I'm not looking at other stuff, but let's just say Scottie Barnes, he did that. And then the first 13 games, he just plateaued, and he was just that again for the first 13 games, or he was a little bit worse. And then the second 13 games, he did what he actually did in these first 13 games. It would be much easier to say, okay, this is probably a little bit noisy. He's not this good, because he didn't have this isn't coming off an entire off season. It's not, it's just a middle of season improvement, which granted do happen sometimes, but I think it's more likely for a player to improve after an entire off season of training and preparing. And I don't think those two things are the same.
Yeah, I just don't agree with that whatsoever. I would need to see some kind of evidence that suggests that like when a player makes a leap that is noticeable early on in the early goings of the season, coming off the back of like their training regimen in the off season. Like I just have no reason to currently believe that that's the case. Like I don't think it's for sure not the case, but maybe that might be our intuition. I don't even, it's not even my intuition, but like, even if it was, intuitively made sense. Like, okay, they just came off of the off season, they're training, they're ready to go, they start the season. Some of what they've done should translate immediately. Even if that was our intuition, I would need to see some evidence that that's the case for me to buy into that. I don't know that to be true.
I don't have the evidence offhand, so I guess that's just going to be one of those areas we agree to disagree. But to me, it's overwhelmingly intuitive, because
yeah, go ahead.
That's how you improve as a basketball. That's at anything. Is if you're going to improve as a shooter, playing in basketball games and shooting the same shots that you, I don't know. I'm a golfer. I'm not getting better at golf by going out and playing 18 holes randomly, and I know I'm replicating the rounds and I'm actually practicing the shots. But if I wanted to go from, currently I'm like a 2 handicap, if I want to go from a 2 to a scratch or a plus handicap, the only way I would do that is if I practiced for 3 months. And to be honest, I'm going to be a little closed-minded here. I do agree that there's a small percent chance that I need the counterfactual and maybe just playing is enough to improve. But I'm very, very skeptical of that. And feel very strongly that the best path to me improving as a golfer would be going to the driving range and practicing as much as possible.
Oh, I think that, yes, I think you're misconstruing my argument. Like, I'm not saying that the best way to get better is by playing. I'm saying you could get better in the off season, but it doesn't translate immediately. Like, I don't think it's like I got better. Like, let's say you were working on your golf game, you had an instructor, you were on the driving range, you just really put it all on, on the line in the off season. Then you came back and you started playing golf, right, with your buddies or whoever you play with. It doesn't mean that because you did all that work, your first day out with your buddies, like, you're going to crush it. Like, you might not crush it that game. You might not crush it that day. You might not crush it for 5 days. It might take a little while, or, you might just be in a bad stretch early on. And then, all that training and improvement comes to fruition later on. Like, it's not a function of like, well, you have to just play and then you get better. It's that, who knows when that really like kicks in. I mean, an example of this may be, I don't know if he is coming off injuries or anything like that. Excuse me. Is LaMelo Ball. I feel like LaMelo Ball started off the season really, really badly. Does that mean he wasn't training this offseason and he wasn't trying to get better? Like, he's been playing at a phenomenal level of late. Like, I wouldn't say that, he wasn't training hard enough and that's why he didn't come out the season like immediately extremely good. I think that's just the nature of how things go when you're playing a sport at such a high level.
Yeah, but it's not everybody improves every season from season to season. That's not what you
exactly
see.
Yeah, exactly, right. That's my point. It's like improvement is not linear and doesn't like take place in a very like laid out constructive way. I work really hard this off season. I'm 22. I work really hard. I come back game 1. I'm really good. And I show everything that I've worked on and it translates immediately. Like, I don't think that that's like a pattern that we see occur every time,
Right. But what I'm saying is that if you have 2 samples, one where player A plays like his past level the first 13 games of the season, and then has a 13-game stretch that is an outlier level of production. And then player B has, he plays one way headed into a season, and then the first 13 games are outlier level of production. I would bet on player B's progression or positive regression or whatever you want to call it being more authentic a slightly higher percentage of the time than player A.
I hear your point. I don't have any evidence for me to kind of conclude that. Like I said, the reason I brought up LaMelo is just because, he's at the age where you would expect him to improve, pretty rapidly, or like, get better, season after season. And we didn't see that right out the gates from him, but we have seen it of late. So, like, would you say that LaMelo's improvement then is probably like less real than somebody like Scottie Barnes who showed it immediately?
Isn't LaMelo Ball over the same exact sample size as Scottie Barnes in like the top 30 in EPM?
Yeah, but it's almost all from like an amazing stretch, like essentially like a 6-game stretch. Like, basically he was, because you could actually, this is a good point too for the audience. Like, if you go to Dunks and Threes, you can also see like a progression of EPM, like in terms of like rolling average, like a 5-game moving average, and you'll see like LaMelo was like started off like relatively bad and then like ramped up like over the last like 6 or 7 games. And even if LaMelo's not a good example, I mean, I can find a guy who's like 23, 22 or something like that, who's like not playing particularly well right now. Let's say Franz Wagner, let's say, or let's say, Jalen Green or something like that, right? Like these guys have not played particularly well so far this season. If they were to 20 games from now, go on an insane 15 game stretch, would you say that that's less likely to be legitimate with regard to their ascendance as players in the NBA as somebody who started off the season really well?
Well, I just think young players improve most of the time anyway. So none of those players improving would surprise me. But I do think that I do think that if Franz is playing at a similar level to how he was playing last season, like if he's playing just way worse than last season, I would feel pretty comfortable being like, oh, okay, this is kind of a noisy stretch. And we're getting into a much more intangible conversation where neither one of us is going to be able to effectively prove anything. So if your whole point is that
the burden is on you because you're making the claim. I'm just saying I don't have any reason to believe the claim. You're making the claim, so I don't have to prove anything. Like if in this discussion,
I just think that we're entering into. There's no way to prove it. So
I don't. How can you have a claim that you have no way to prove?
What do you mean? I'm just saying in theory. You could. This is such a vague. I guess this is such a vague,
like ambiguous.
Intuition. Yeah, this is just so ambiguous, and there's so many factors. I just don't think anything would be enough for you. So I just think we're just going to agree to disagree, I guess.
I mean, no, I think that there could be an enough for me. So like the enough for me would be like some kind of data that shows that, let's say, young players below a certain threshold, when they perform really well early on in a season, that is more highly correlated to like success or their peak as a player than if they.
But how young? How many games? We're just
we'd have to define all of that. We'd have to define all of that.
But I haven't even. But yeah. I'm just literally, let's reel this back in and start with Scottie Barnes.
Yeah.
And go back to Scottie Barnes. I don't think it's unreasonable to conclude that a 22-year-old progressed to a certain point and that work he did in the offseason would show itself immediately starting a new season. To me, that is slightly more meaningful than if it happened during a random 13. I'm just making up 13 games because that's what we're working with right now. But it could have been 20 games. Right. To me, that is slightly more likely to be meaningful than a 20-game stretch in February and March. I'm not saying that if Jalen Green has a really good 20-game stretch in February or March, then that's just, it doesn't mean anything. No, I'm just saying that on the whole, in a vacuum, I think it is slightly more meaningful if it just comes out of the gate because it's coming on the heels of all this time you had to not master your craft, but improve your craft.
Yeah, I totally hear you. And I guess to summarize my opinion on that, I think that that's your intuition, which is reasonable. But I think that there's many times when our intuitions are not correct or don't lead us in the right direction. And I would just need to see some kind of like evidence to support that perspective that would make me believe it to be true. And the fact
what I'm saying with that regarding the evidence, how would we even define it? Would we separate like, okay, this is how it happens for year 2 to year 3 guys? Okay, well, not every year 2 to year 3 guy is created equally. What about guys who came out as seniors as opposed to guys who came out as freshmen? What about guys who
supporting my view though? My view is essentially agnostic towards this perspective, and you're saying like you would always have to be agnostic.
It's not supporting your view because Scottie Barnes was a top 5 pick who was 19 years old when he came out of the draft. That's different than just turning it into how do we create a vacuum? This isn't a scenario that exists in a vacuum. This is a very
Yeah.
specific scenario.
Right. Exactly. Yes. So my point is that you can never prove this perspective. You can never prove it to be true. You could never provide evidence that says that this is true, meaning that you are holding an opinion, a position that is unprovable, which is I like that. That's fine. You can have that. You can have that belief, but it just doesn't, like, we just won't know. And so it's, there's no reason for me to believe it just because you do. You know what I mean? Like, I have no reason to believe it. It's your intuition. It's not mine. And I have no reason to believe it. You know what I mean?
I do, but you take that line of arguing to its logical endpoint, and you could say that about anything. And then it's like, what's the point of talking about
No,
anything?
you would for other things, you would be able to provide evidence for them, right? Like if I was to say, I think Nikola Jokic is the best center of all time, then I could provide a heaps of evidence to support that perspective, and that would, ideally be able to convert people whose intuition doesn't follow. So like that would be how I would argue something. I would say, here's my argument, here's my claim, and here's the evidence for it. And I would provide the evidence, and then you would look at the veracity of the evidence, and then you would say, oh yeah, that shit, that stuff, that evidence really backs up that claim. I think I'm moving closer to that claim than you are, or than I was initially. But you can't do that for me, so I have no reason
to be
move.
clear, because I don't have a spreadsheet full of third
Hashtag
year
spreadsheet.
20. I don't have a spreadsheet full of third year 22-year-old top 5 picks improving at the start of their third year that just dismisses the claim. Like that's not that. You, as someone who's watched the NBA your entire life, that's not just like, oh yeah, that kind of does happen all the time, and that's just a totally normal thing.
All right. So I mean, we have to really narrow down on what the claim is, though. Like I'm not saying that 22-year-olds don't improve going into their 20. Like that's not what my claim is. Your claim is specifically that they would show their improvement immediately in the season, and that's more meaningful than if they show their improvement at a later point in the season. That's the claim that I'm disputing.
Yeah, like at the margin, it's slightly more meaningful.
Okay, there's no way to provide. You would have to provide evidence for that to support that claim. Like what? How else would I believe your claim? Just based on what? What would I use to say? That's not my intuition, right? It's your intuition. It's not my intuition. What would I use in order for me to change my view to say that I think that is true? Like, how can I do that?
Yeah, I guess you wouldn't. So, as I said 10 minutes ago, I'm happy to just agree to disagree.
Yeah, that's just my point. It's like I have no reason to change my view on it. My view is that I'm agnostic towards it. I don't believe it's true. I don't believe it's not true. I just don't know. And you believe it's true. And so for me to be like, yeah, I do believe it's true, I would need to see something to like push me in that direction.
But that part of it doesn't even really matter. The main thrust of my point is that it's not unreasonable to me that Scottie Barnes got a lot better as a basketball player.
And I agree with that. I agree with. I don't think it's like semantic. I think it's like what it comes down to. It's like because I could just say like, well, my intuition is like whatever I have. And then you would say, well, mine is not. And I'd be like, well, we just agree to disagree. Like, it's like we have to be able to have some substance to say like why I believe this is true. And here's my evidence to support it. Like, I don't think we can just like say like, I could say my intuition is that like players work really hard in the offseason, young players work really hard in the offseason, and then they need like 20 games of like game speed to like be able to integrate what they've learned into that environment. And so I think actually when we see players like make their leap 20 games into a season, I think that's more reflective of a legitimate jump that shows that they're integrating what they've learned. And early season success is just a function of like, luck
more variance
or variance. Yeah. So that could be my intuition. And it's like, you'd be like, well, I don't agree with it. And I'd be like, well, I do. Like, like, where are we? We don't. That's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think you're more right than I am, thinking about it more.
Yeah, let's talk about like one more thing as far as like things that we've noticed from EPM. Because
Well, I said my guy. Who jumped out to you? There's
yeah,
plenty of interesting players.
there's plenty of interesting players to pick out. I, I think, yeah, I would say Nikola Jokic. No, I'm just kidding. He's just the same as the best.
He's not number one though. Look at it. Look at Embiid finally being the impact guy.
It just updated from today. I guess Jokic had a poor defensive performance, and his defensive EPM sunk below league average, which has dropped him down below Embiid in the early goings. I think I want to cite Tyrese Haliburton. Is a player I want to cite. So getting myself in trouble with Knicks fans is going to be.
I was literally about to say that your mission is to get banned from Knicks Twitter.
It is going to be a theme. Tyrese Haliburton currently has an offensive EPM of plus 7.4. Just to put into context, last year players who were 7.4 or above on offensive EPM, Nikola Jokic and Damian Lillard. The previous year, only Nikola Jokic. The previous year, Nikola Jokic and Steph Curry. And the previous year, no one. James Harden had the highest in 2020 with a 7.2 offensive EPM. So speaking of, blips and, variance and other factors, noise that come into play, do I think Tyrese Haliburton is one of the greatest offensive impact players ever? No, I don't think so. But I do think he has demonstrated to be an incredible offensive engine to a team. Not only is his offensive EPM plus 7.4, which would be historically great, he also has a 47.6 assist percentage, which is completely absurd. And even though I don't necessarily care about like assists specifically as a stat, that is just a clear demonstration of the amount of responsibility that he has as a ball handler, and the amount that his choices and decisions on the basketball court dictate the offensive results for that team. And on top of that, he only has an 11.4 turnover percentage, which would be about league average. To have that level of responsibility for the offense and have that few turnovers, essentially to be driving an offensive team, to be driving a team's entirety of their offense, it's incredible. Like how he's played so far this season, it's incredible. He would be, to me, clearly a top 3 MVP candidate right now, or top 3 or to 5 MVP candidates. And I just think he is an incredible offensive player. I think it's like undeniable. And like I said, obviously this is over 11 game sample. Do I think he's going to be at this level for the whole season? No. I think a coming down to earth for him will look like, a +5 or something EPM. Which is actually around what he was last year. So I think there will be some consistency there. And I think that we're just seeing what we're seeing in the early goings this season is a validation and a reinforcement of, the impact that he's had on his team and how good an offensive player that he is.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at, just what he's doing offensively across the board, true shooting's up. Assist percentage somehow is up. Turnover percentage is down despite his usage increasing. He's rebounding more. He's just doing everything better so far. I do think Haliburton is a really interesting. I know we're trying to stick with purely objective impact data, but I do think he's an interesting case study. And I think this just applies to everyone. I think everybody knows about the Haliburton versus Brunson debate. Right. And I think that Haliburton versus Brunson is interesting to me because it's kind of the poster for 82 game impact versus what you can do when you're matched up against, and what you can do, maybe in a single series, maybe a single playoff series. Because when I watch Tyrese Haliburton, great shooter, obviously amazing passer, gets into the paint, forces collapses. I'll be very curious to see if his impact holds when he's scouted against, because he has no interest in scoring at the second level at all. And to me, that could have a more intangible negative effect on his overall impact than in the playoffs and against great defense. He's kind of, not kind of, he's a better passing, better offensive version of what I was talking about with Emmanuel quickly earlier. Because when defenses scout and realize that he's either trying to get to the rim or trying to shoot a three, and they realize that he has no interest in shooting from 10 to 20 feet, they're going to let him snake into the paint. They're going to fight over his screens and trail, and then they're just going to take away the rim. And if he doesn't have an answer to that, I think we could see him struggle. So I have no way or interest in refuting what you said about how amazing he's been to start the season. I think he's an amazing basketball player. But purely in terms of his future development and him evolving as a basketball player, I think the next step for him, obviously defense is he's a bad defender. He's a bad defender.
I didn't talk about defense for a purpose.
He's got to get better at defense, obviously. Even just do what we've seen from Brunson this season. I mean, Brunson's not good at defense, but he's trying and he's in the right spots a lot, which is 75% of the battle. Haliburton's a mess defensively. But as far as offensive improvement goes, I think the next step for him is adding more variety to how he scores so that he forces a wider range of collapses and a wider range of attention, because that's how he maintains his passing impact and his elevating of teammates. And now I'm worried when I make claims like this, if I don't have proof that, being a better scorer at the second level will elevate him. But that is my natural intuition from watching basketball, that I think there's a chance he's going to be a more exploitable offensive player than some of his peers due to his reluctance to shoot or impact the game from that mid-range.
Yeah, so I think that's a definitely valid point. I think that is kind of the only weakness that I see from his offensive game, besides maybe he doesn't have the best ability to isolate and take someone off the dribble and just score on them at will. But I think I don't know why he would need to necessarily, because they can just run screens for him. So I think he can isolate a really slow-footed defensive player that might switch onto him after a screen. So to me, that is probably the primary weakness. I will say at the same time, he is, I don't think this is sustainable, to be clear, but from 8 to 16 feet, he is shooting 58% so far this season. So he is really crushing from that kind of closer mid-range so far in the early goings. But I do think it's still a weakness, and I think that's what teams are going to give him. They're going to kind of let him get to that close into the paint and then see what he does from there. Because last year he actually shot 40% from that 8 to 16 foot range, which is not very good, and which teams would happily welcome him right down here into this 8 to 16 foot range and see what he can do. So I totally agree that that's an area where he needs to continue to develop. I will say he has developed in that, quote unquote developed. I mean, it's only been 11 games, but he has performed really well in that area. And it's kind of funny, you compared him in this way to Emmanuel Quickley. It's also where Emmanuel Quickley has had his improvement so far, at this stage of the season. So we'll see if he's able to keep that up. He is clearly a 40% 3-point shooter. I have no idea how with his release. I don't know how that's consistent, but
so wild.
It doesn't make sense to me in terms of his ability to be so consistent with that shot. Shooting 41% from three in his career on 1,170 3-point attempts. So I think he's clearly a tremendous 3-point shooter, borderline elite. And I don't know how, but he is. And I think that is the weakness if you're trying to say we're going to game plan for him. But if he figures that out, as he has so far early in the season, I don't know how you stop him as an offensive engine. I don't actually see another recourse.
Especially when in the starting lineup, I'm not going to say they go 5 out, but they have 5 willing 3-point shooters at all
Yep.
times in the starting lineup. So the space is immaculate. He's working with way more space than Jalen Brunson is, to be fair to Brunson. And yeah, I mean, if he is willing to pull up from 15 feet and the big who's in drop has to respect that, once he's doing that, you just, because when he's either pulling up from 3, he's pulling up and you're from 15 feet and shooting, you just said 58% from mid range. That's lethal. Or he's, reading where the help is coming from and starting that read and react that, Knicks fans will be very familiar with. And he's very good at that. That's why he has over a 50% assist percentage. Is there any worry for you from I don't think it matters this year. I don't think any Pacers fans have delusions of winning a championship, but is there any concern from you in the macro that he's too ball dominant? I know he's a great shooter, but he doesn't seem to love shooting off the catch unless it's a wide open shot, at least from what I watch.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I honestly, I was kind of watching in FIBA for this exact thing because I was curious about that myself. I think he's a really good off-ball player. And as far as shooting off the catch, this year, I mean, he definitely shoots pull-ups at a much higher rate. This year, he's shooting 53% on catch and shoot threes. And I don't think he's like a 53% catch and shoot 3-point shooter, which would obviously be absurd and break all kinds of abilities to fathom what that would look like. But, last year he shot 40% on catch and shoot threes. I think he is a really good catch and shoot player. I think he can be a easily like plug and play off ball guy. I do think his best impact is going to come from him being on the ball. Kind of like we talked about Trae Young. I think he's like a better version of Trae Young in that way because his best impact comes from being on the ball and being the guy running pick and rolls and running spread pick and rolls and shooting threes, getting into the paint, throwing lobs, kicking out to 3-point shooters with the 5-out concept that they do sometimes. So I think that's his biggest impact, but I also think he can impact the game really well off ball, especially if he's ever able to be a decent defensive player. Like you mentioned, he's been awful defensively this season, even worse than he has been in years past. So I think, to me, as far as like an off ball guy, I think he can be a connector, obviously with his amazing vision and passing, or very good vision and passing, I should say. And with his amazing shooting off the catch. So I think he is there's no redundancies with him as an offensive player. I think you can plug, even if you put like a great superstar level isolation scorer next to him, I think it would still work really well. He wouldn't have his best impact because his best impact would be with the ball in his hands, but I don't think he would like take away from the impact of the team if that was the case.
I think one of the coolest things that the Pacers do is they use him in all parts of the court. And to me, that's rare. You see it a lot with Luka, but Luka's far more heliocentric than Haliburton is. But, I've seen Haliburton running side pick and rolls with Obi and Turner. Obviously, he gets plenty of run at the top of the key. And I think that helps mitigate a heliocentric style because it makes you tougher to predict. It makes you less predictable. Rick Carlisle is he's a really good offensive mind. I feel like he's kind of gotten lost in the shuffle of really good coaches because it didn't exactly work out with Luka, and those Mavericks years kind of faded away. But he's been very consistently in the upper echelon of coaches, and it's not really surprising to me that he's a good fit with Haliburton.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. I've always been a fan of Rick Carlisle since the Dallas days, so I would totally agree with that.
The last thing I just want to say about these EPM things. So you have a couple guys at the top who are the staples in terms of being in their prime right now, and they're in their late 20s, and me and you have talked about 28, 29 years old. These are your prime years. These are your absolute prime years in a vacuum. So, you've got Embiid, you've got Jokic, you've got Donovan Mitchell, you've got Jason Tatum, you've got Luka, again, you've got Devin Booker, Giannis. These are all guys who it's not surprising you see at the top. And then you have a couple of young guys who snuck in there: Chet Holmgren, Tyrese Maxey, Şengün, SGA, Scottie Barnes. Amazing. That's so cool to see young guys ascending a little bit sooner than they're probably expected to. And yes, I agree with you that there will probably be some regression from them. They're more likely to regress from their current regular season impact than a Jason Tatum is. I think Jason Tatum's just safe. If anything, he could get better from an impact perspective, which is kind of scary for the rest of the league. I just want to point out, in the top 15, you have Paul George, Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, and LeBron James. Those four are four of the top 15 players in overall regular season impact. LeBron James is fifth. I mean, what the hell, man? Look, I'm not like a LeBron stan. I don't care about the all-time argument, but I am very much an enjoy and appreciate what you have person. And as someone who has a near photographic memory for this shit, fun fact about me, just random fun fact for anybody who's listening almost 3 hours in. You can pick any postseason from the last 12 years since the first LeBron in Miami season. And I can, from memory, tell you every team in the bracket of that postseason and what happened in the full playoffs. So I can just basically you can pull up the wiki bracket and I can be like 1-8, 2-7. Here's how that series went. Here's how that series went. And then just read the whole playoffs for you. So I have a very good memory for this stuff. LeBron had a triple-double in his first ever playoff game. That was April of 2006. So everybody listening to this, just think about what you were doing in 2006. And LeBron has basically been at the top of the league since then. There's no comparison for this in NBA history. Like, Kareem won a championship in 1971. Amazing. Kareem was an amazing basketball player. And then the Lakers won another championship in 1988. That was their second, and then they went for the three-peat in 1989. So Kareem had that longevity. But I promise you, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in 1988 was not Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in 1971. Magic Johnson was the star. And LeBron has been waiting for Anthony Davis to be his Magic Johnson for 3 seasons now. And for some reason, it's still on LeBron to be like this for the Lakers to even just be 8-6. It's remarkable. And I hope that on some level, anybody who's listening can just be like, this dude's going to retire. I don't know. I don't even want to put a time on it because who knows, but he's going to retire probably in the next, year, 2 years. And that's going to be in my opinion, the league's going to be worse because this is one of, if not the greatest basketball player of all time. And he's just doing things that we'll never see again. I mean, 5th in the NBA in overall impact. And he's not one of the oldest. He's the oldest player in the NBA, the oldest player in the NBA. And he career high true shooting percentage. True shooting percentage is 65%. Remember when people were like, oh, well, I guess LeBron past his prime could be like a worse Karl Malone and just set screens all the time. No, he does set screens now. He's a more versatile player, but he's initiating from the perimeter still and dunking on people. It's just, there's no precedent for this. There's no, everything XJ said earlier about well, we've never seen it before, so I'm just going to assume that it's not real. That's been LeBron's last 5 years. If that were true, you would assume that everything LeBron has done since, that last beautiful season in Cleveland when he dragged that terrible team to the finals. None of this is real. How can it be real? You've never seen anything like it before. I just keep using the word. It's remarkable. It's crazy. When these rankings came out, I saw that. I was just like, holy shit, dude. Plus, you'll know this better than me. I don't think he's been a positive on defense for the last couple seasons. He's a positive on defense. That's the whole book on him is LeBron rests on defense because he can't make it through games, and somehow he's a positive impactor for one of the league's best team defenses. That's insane.
Yeah, just LeBron has been considered a positive on defense for the past like 6 or 7 years. But yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. Well, I thought that makes it even funnier that that if you want something to sum up LeBron James, there it is. There's a whole narrative that I believe that he's just this negative on defense because he doesn't try, and
he's definitely not been at his peak defensively for sure, but he has been like a pretty high level defensive impact player, according to EPM. All right, well, we are who knows how many hours in we are. It's a High Hand Theory podcast. I am gonna wrap it up. This has been a really long and fun episode talking about so many different topics. The clips are gonna come flying out of this one. I thank you all so much if you're with us and hanging in there. I'm not gonna give a code word to share with us now, or else Geoff and I would be losing a lot of money if we kept doing it. But definitely appreciate you so much for still being here and supporting the podcast. Yeah, please drop a comment, a like, a subscribe. Anything that you can do is super helpful for us growing. And any last words you want to say, Geoff?
No, you closed it out perfectly. Thanks to everyone who made it this far. And if you catch the third act, I'm going to call it, because we're literally at the end of the third hour, and you hear us, having a little disagreement, I was reminded of how I used to talk to my father. And I still talk to my father. And whenever we would debate stuff, he would just like intentionally poke holes in my argument. And I would just get so frustrated. I would just sit there and get so mad. And he would be like, and I would be like, but how come you don't have to do this? Where's your burden of proof? And he would say, I don't care about my side. I'm just trying to help you argue better and like be more prepared. And arguing with XJ reminded me of that in the best way, because like I do feel the only thing that like you'll be able to tell that I just got more and more frustrated as the conversation was going on. And I wasn't frustrated with XJ. I was frustrated with myself for not having like better arguments, for not being able to present more and better evidence. So hopefully next time, I do have, if I do raise a point like that and XJ is like, well, wait a second, where's your proof? I do have the proof, or I do make a better and more substantial argument. And there's value to that. And there's value in that self-realization. So I hope people, even if it wasn't the most substantial, Jesus, 3 hours, substantial discussion, I hope people can take at least that from that there's, not only in what you're arguing matters, but how you're arguing it and how you're presenting your point. Because the internet and just people you talk to on Twitter, they're coming into this, 90% of them are coming into this with I'm right and I'll never see your side. So if you're going to have any chance in these waters, you have to just have the most rock solid arguments. And I didn't at that moment. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and well said. And I think that there's a lot of value listening to Hot Hand Theory. You're going to learn how to argue, all kinds of things that are coming out. But I think that's well said. And
but I mean, dude, that's an amazing response. I was basically like, yeah, XJ was right. And you're like, yeah, I think that's a great point,
No, I don't think that I honestly don't think that I was like necessarily like right about anything. Like for instance, like to me, argumentation comes down to you make a claim and either you provide evidence for the claim or you provide the kind of deductive reason why your claim is true. And so you have to have like a premise conclusion kind of situation. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Or you have evidence that comes from like, the scientific, the scientific, gosh, I can't even think of what it's called now. What is it? The scientific, method. Sorry, the scientific method.
Dude, I messed that up last week. So
did you?
I feel a little bit less.
Scientific method?
Literally the second straight week we've referenced the scientific method, and I called it the scientific theory or something. I said method.
I was going to say that. Wait, is that? I think that was burrowed in my brain. Yeah. I was going to say theory for some reason. I was like, I know it's not theory. Anyway.
So of course it's my fault. I'm the idiot who put that in your head.
Yeah, so like that's how I look at the argumentation. I wasn't, honestly, I wasn't, my goal wasn't to just like poke holes in your argument, and not, it genuinely was to be like when I argue about things, like I do want to be swayed to a different perspective, but I just need
Right.
either.
You were trying to maximize my point.
Yeah,
You were trying to
exactly.
maximize the effectiveness of my point. That's why I
Right.
was growing frustrated, because I wasn't prepared with the ability to make the best case that I could.
Right. Right. Yeah. Um yeah, 3 hours in, this has been a great conversation, and if you're still with us for potentially part 3 or whatever part this is, yeah, much appreciation, and we will be back next week to have another long round of anecdotes and tangents and arguments that go on for hours. So this has been Hot Hand Theory.